For those of you who have been to Global Chats in the past, welcome back. This session's going to feel a little bit different, more of a conversation about adaptive leadership. And Carl and I are going to talk about some examples we have with some organizations, why adaptive leadership. So as we were thinking about what would make a good topic for conversation, what occurred to us was, what do we constantly hear from clients these days? And what we hear is how fast things are changing. So advancements in AI, shifts in technology, market disruption. And one of the things that we know helps in terms of dealing with challenges like that is a lens and perspective around adaptive leadership. So if that term isn't familiar to you, that's fine. We're going to define it, or rather, Carl's going to define it in just a moment. And then, as I said, we're going to explore how organizations are using adaptive leadership to prepare for the future. And then, as always, we're going to open it up for your questions. So with that, Carl, I'm going to turn it to you in just a moment here. So when we think about adaptive leadership, there's two things. One of them is adaptive leadership has been a foundation of ours for many, many years. So ground us a little bit on why is it so important and what is it?
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting on this as we were preparing for today, and the first ever client presentation that we gave in 2000, I think it was the end of 2009. The second bullet point was the rise of adaptive leadership, and the subtext was yesterday's tools won't solve tomorrow's problems. And it was neat just listening to what you were saying just then about all of the change and the disruption that we're feeling at the moment, and which is giving rise to this topic, and which is why we're here talking about in this global chat adaptive leadership today. I think it felt the same then. And I think this is just kind of like there's a little bit of a repeating pattern, because underneath it there is a really deeply human experience behind adaptive leadership, and also not just human experience, but reality about the world that we live in. And I think in many ways, the reason it's such an interesting topic is because we spend a lot of our time trying to imagine or create realities for a world that doesn't have a lot of complexity and require a lot of adaptation from us consistently. So with that as a preamble, the way we define it in really simple terms is that there are technical challenges and there are adaptive challenges. Technical challenges are those where we have expertise, either we as individuals or someone, to solve the problem or deal with the challenge. Somebody's done it before and they've done it really well. And our job when we're in leadership is to identify that and make sure that the person or us have the time and resources to do the job that they know how to do. And if they don't know how to do it, we find the right person or we train them. And that's how we sort of deal with technical challenges. And a lot of our careers, especially early in our careers, we get given things to do that are predominantly dealing with technical challenges. On the other hand, there are adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges are those that have never been encountered before and are novel. And if you find an expert who says they know what to do, they might actually be one of the biggest problems when you're dealing with adaptive challenges, because they are unknown in nature. They're things that haven't yet been dealt with. And the job is to apply leadership and learn and understand the situation and deploy effort to the system level. The problem that we have, and the reason this is such an interesting topic, is because we spend a lot of our time using the wrong approach for the challenge that we have. So most often, and Ron Heifetz has sort of pretty much invented this field and written prolifically on it, and he talks about the biggest source of waste in organisations is treating adaptive challenges as if they are technical. So we have something that is highly new, highly adaptive. None of us have encountered it before. The organisation hasn't encountered it before. Let's say AI agents entering our workforce. And yet we create a big change plan. And we have a series of events and things that we're going to do in order to prepare ourselves and everyone else for it. And we think that that's going to solve it. And when it doesn't work, we're not sure. So we're trying to use an approach which works perfectly well for technical problems, but for an adaptive challenge. And that causes us that's why a lot of change efforts fail. And it causes us a lot of angst. We'll talk a little bit more about this later in this chat, though. I've also seen the opposite, and I've seen the opposite surprisingly often, where we have a technical challenge where somebody does know how to do it. We have solved it before, and I think you'll probably all have experienced this in an organisation. And we'll go about running some experiments and trying to learn. And I think Agile as a methodology, which I'm a huge fan of and think is incredibly powerful, has perpetuated this in organisations, where we actually use a learning model where we experiment and hypothesize and try and discover what the underlying pattern is, when actually somebody else has already done that work. And our job should have just been to find the person and the resources and deploy what we already know works. And that also creates a lot of organisational waste. To make it really grounded, a couple of examples, I think training, close to our heart, or especially leadership development, is almost the perfect example of an adaptive challenge. You can create an incredible plan, deliver an amazing presentation, do all the technical elements absolutely perfectly, and yet the participants in the experience may or may not get any value from it, because developing is an adaptive challenge. For them to develop, they need to try out the things that you're talking about and experiment with it themselves. They need to actually have a felt experience of what they're being taught. Their boss and their co-workers and their clients and their customers and their suppliers all need to have some skin in the game as well, because they're going to act differently. And often a system, when somebody's acting differently, tells it to go back and act how it used to, because that's how they're used to it behaving. And so we talk a lot about adaptive challenges requiring change at a system level, and no single person having authority over it, and it requires a lot of different moving parts. And so when we think about training or certainly development, it's a great example of, you can take the technical bits and do them pretty easily, but that's not solving the challenge. There's a whole lot of things around it. Ron, who started his career as a surgeon, gives the beautiful, simple example about saying heart surgery is very, very hard, yet we can literally fix somebody's heart. We can do coronary bypass surgery. That's a technical thing. We know how to do that. However, the behaviours and lifestyle that got the person in the need of having to have heart surgery, that's an adaptive challenge, because that might involve their friends who come around on Friday nights and like to have a drink and eat fried chicken. And all of those factors that exist around that person, if you really want to change the underlying source of that thing that you can fix technically and want it to avoid coming back, you've got an adaptive challenge. And I think when you think of it like that, we deal with lots. The last thing I'll say is that if this feels familiar to some other things you've heard, it's because it is. Some theorists call them tame challenges and wicked problems. Those of you familiar with Kniffen, we may revisit this later too. Technical is kind of the simple and hard domain, whereas adaptive is the complex and chaotic domain. So the reason that we're really enjoying adaptive at the moment is I think from an ecosystem point of view, and it borrows from nature. We're in constant motion. We always have been. Everything around us is. And one of the things that nature does best is adapt. And it's a constant adaptive process. And so that's where I think that language has got a really strong, powerful message for us all on this topic anyway. Hopefully that helps from a definition point of view. And with that, I'll pass back to Corey, because we've had some really interesting experiences in the last couple of years with this topic. It does feel like it's exaggerated. And large retailer working in a very standardised industry, Corey, we were dealing with lots and lots and lots of technical challenges that need to be done well, and most organisations don't do them well. And so we've been working with some that do them very well, and yet I'm curious for you to share how this topic still comes up.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Carl. So I think that is a great example, and it's been fascinating to work with them and see the impact of this frame around adaptive challenges and adaptive leadership So, as you mentioned, this organization, Fortune 50 retailer, very process oriented. There's a process for literally everything. And so, what happens when leaders are confronted with challenges where there is no process? And so, what was interesting in working with them was talking about, technical versus adaptive. We define these are technical challenges. That's what that looks like. And then adaptive challenges. And then talked about challenges that are bundled, challenges where, yes, there are technical components. You can find experts to help you solve that, but then there are some adaptive components. And so, really, our work with them began by talking about breaking challenges apart and helping them figure out which pieces are technical and which pieces are adaptive. Even by taking that step and understanding the two different components in the challenge was amazingly helpful. Um, the other thing that was interesting then is once you have the adaptive challenge pieces, there are no known solutions. We think about an organization, a retailer going through the pandemic. So many adaptive challenges in that situation. And what was helpful there is encouraging these leaders to tap into the wisdom of the crowd. Because no one person knows the answer, it's helpful to get your team engaged, helpful to get peers engaged, your leader engaged, because you need new information. You need to encourage open conversation and really empower your team. And so did work with them to help them understand how really to empower the team, particularly when the team is used to following processes and knowing first I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do that. There was also a lot of great conversation with them talking about what have they done well in handling adaptive challenges. And one of the things they talked about is being comfortable in ambiguity, because it's so tempting. The challenge comes in, you want to solve it and you want to get rid of it and move to the next piece. But they really talked about being comfortable in that space of not knowing, that gray space. Maybe the only thing you know is the next step that you're going to take. They also talked a lot about how they would collect new information, how they would even understand what next step to take. And it was about experimentation. Let's try something, let's reflect on what we've learned, and then let's figure out the next step. And then overall, and Carl, you mentioned that we've been working with them for a handful of years. What we're really seeing is a shift towards a culture of continuous learning, of innovation. Certainly, there are best practices that need to be followed, but when they're facing these adaptive challenges, really leaning into that and being resilient, because it sometimes doesn't feel as straightforward and energizing when you're facing these adaptive challenges. So that's what I'd share on that example. Carl, I'd love to hand back to you to talk about, we've worked with several tech companies, certainly facing a lot of adaptive challenges these days, and would love to hear you talk about some of those examples.
I will, Corey. I'm going to bounce back to you quickly though first, because I've got a question for you. The
Sorry, yeah.
no. It's the I noticed that in this retail environment that it was that when you were talking about bundling, the element that was just about always adaptive was dealing with people. Do you want to talk more about like that, how that showed up, just that side of the adaptive challenge? Because it doesn't matter
Abs-
how technical a nature your business is, you're going to be dealing with people.
No, I think that's a great question. So one of the challenges they would often talk about is just the integration of new technology. And so certainly there's a technical side of that. We need to ramp people up. They need to understand how to use the technology. But then there's an adaptive component there because you've introduced some new step, some new process. So you need to engage people's hearts and minds into adapting to this change. And so many of the challenges they talked about, whether it be retention, whether it be attracting, you know, new people to apply to the company and then stay there, anything dealing with people, how they think, how they behave, their mindsets, all of that is just adaptive. These leaders are leading teams of, 3 to 500 people. So engaging people's hearts and minds through in, empowering them, helping them create, come up with their own solutions was really important to them. What else would you add, Carl?
Oh, just riffing on that. I think that's I said before, and we're going a little bit off piste here, which I think is good. I said before about a real challenge being treating technical challenges as if they're adaptive, and we end up sort of experimenting and iterating a bit. I think that the sort of the paradox at play here is when it comes to human behaviour, and this is just a new thought really. When it comes to human behaviour, many of the things that we need to do, or we need people to do, we want them to do, are kind of technical in nature. I sort of think we started some of our first organisations we ever worked with. It was in a health and safety environment, and you needed to shift behaviour in order to keep people safe. And the most reliable way that you could not shift people's behaviour was tell them exactly what to do. I mean, and there's a whole lot of behavioral psychology and neuroscience behind this. It's like people have to kind of like come up with it themselves. It's one of the fundamental ideas behind shifting behaviour, and see the value in that different behaviour in itself. That's the adaptive part of the challenge, I think, because it's really tricky. Everyone's got their own motivators. There's almost an infinite variety of experiences that people have. And so even when the challenge is pretty technical, you've got this adaptive component because it's about human behaviour. And when you just set engaging hearts and minds, I think that is the tricky thing, and that's the thing that we need to. The minute we think we've got that worked out, we're in trouble. I can give feedback to one person using a framework, and it can go perfectly well. And I go, okay, great. This is the feedback framework. This is how I do it. And I talk to somebody else, and unbeknown to me, there's something lurking in their past, an experience that they've had that I somehow trigger, and it blows up in my face, and I'm like, this doesn't work. And I can see lots of nods here at the moment because I think we've all experienced this. And there's actually nothing wrong with the technique. It's just our expectation of it, and lack of appreciation for the adaptive side of this. So I think there's a big lesson for us all in that. So that even when there is a real solid technical thing that we need to get people to do, we need to lean into this adaptive side of it. You asked about work with some of the tech firms. I'm going to do this slightly in reverse too. One thing that we've done with a couple of these organisations that are going through large transformations at the moment, big change. So this topic is super interesting to them. We've asked them in the workouts that we had on our Adeption platform, or pre-work for a simple term, we've asked them to reflect on times that they've been involved in or led change that has gone really well. And they've given these answers. It's amazing. You ask a question like that, people go give a lot of detail. And then we've been ask them to reflect on times they've been involved in or led change that's gone really poorly. And we've asked them to describe the approach that they took. This is all before they learn anything about adaptive technical, any of the framing that we've just been talking about. These are straight up cold sort of onboarding questions. Tell us about a time you've seen or been part of or led change that's gone well. What approach did you take? Tell us about when it's gone poorly. What approach have you taken? And we've had, even in the last couple of months, in some tech firms, hundreds of responses to those two questions. We've got a data scientist in our team who's really interested in this technical adaptive framing. And so he's built an algorithm off the back of the large language models that we're all excited about and have access to at the moment, that looks at the language they use for those two different scenarios, and to just determine which leadership approach was used. And it is incredible. I think, I'm not going to do it disservice, I think it's 84% of the time adaptive framing is used when people talk about change that's gone well. And it's remarkable. And, technical framing is used a similar proportion of time when they reflect on change that's gone poorly. So the interesting thing about this is we know it. There should be nothing to teach. There actually should be like literally nothing to teach because this is just a felt experience. Like we've just about all experienced what Corey and I have been talking about here. And maybe in our field, and I'm broadly going to say that you're here because you're interested in leadership development. That's it was certainly a good reflection for me to think, well, actually, maybe we could say less and just get out of the way a bit more and just create those moments because I think there's plenty of felt experience out there, and we just kind of need to connect those dots and let people know that they're not the ones that are having those unique experiences. They're actually happening for a lot. The great thing about the tech industry is that there's lots of people, especially I'm in San Francisco at the moment, and we can get a lot of data like that from people. Um, the big firms that we're working with at the moment, we've got a few things in common. And I'm fascinated by. I was originally trained as an engineer, and I kind of got into this field because it was so frustrating. I couldn't technically solve all the challenges that I saw. Like it was like I can't engineer my way out of these things. And what do you know? I end up here being infinitely curious and experimenting with these ideas of adaptive leadership. But the tech industry, when I first started as a software engineer, the projects that I worked on we were taking mainframe applications, which is when compute power was very centralized, expensive, room-sized machines, and technology changes had put compute power on the desktop of people. So this happened in organizations before it happened with the personal computer. And so that created what they call client-server applications, where some of the compute power was on the desktop and some of it remained on the mainframe. And that was revolutionary. Some of the biggest organisations in the world that we know today were built under that paradigm. And it was exciting work to be doing. I was telling a story to somebody not that long ago, and they said, this ages you, Carl, and I'm like, yeah. And it does. But I was sharing how at the back end of that experience of mine as an engineer was when cloud computing first started emerging, which was a little bit of a back to the future moment because there was compute power on the cloud distributed, not in one mainframe, but sort of accessible anywhere. And that meant that we could start creating different types of applications where you moved compute power off the desktop into the cloud and you rented software. You didn't have to own it. And that is the paradigm that you name the biggest tech firms in the world today, pretty much, especially in the business-to-business sense. They took down many of those client-server organisations and became the biggest organisations in the world. And for 20 years, they perfected the playbook of software as a service, renting software to help you do your job more efficiently and better. And the other firms that we're working with right now, and they've got these common things, and I have a lot of respect for them, because one of the reasons that we're one of a number of, a small part of a lot of work that they're doing. But the reason that they're investing in leadership development at the moment is because they are very aware that it's a cliche, but what got us here won't get us there. The very thing that's led the past 20 years of growth, the playbooks that they've invented, are changing, because what's happening now is this cloud-based compute power is being replaced by AI, which means that the new model is that software isn't helping us do our job. Software is doing our job for and with us. I'm not into doom and gloom conversation about AI, but it's really changing the nature of work. It's not only changing the nature of work, but it's changing the nature of the business models that these organisations use. So subscription pricing doesn't make so much sense if you're selling seats for people using it. Because what if you've got an agent that does the job of 4,000 seats? And who's going to pay for a subscription model for an agent that maybe doesn't do any jobs and doesn't deliver any value? So it's changing expectations, both the buyer's side, these organisations, their business models, the type of platforms that they create, the org structures that they've got to drive those business models, and the technologies that they just like literally every part of these multi-billion-dollar organisations is having to be reinvented. And they're leaning into it, they're aware of it, and they're doing it proactively, which is the great thing. I think they're, trying to learn from the organisations that missed the jump into cloud computing, and we're still trying to sort of think of selling software rather than people renting it. And that is just a massive change, and it means that this idea of thinking about this new set of problems. The challenge within these organisations is not so much about how do we continue to be really good at what we know how to do, but it's how do we lean into this adaptive model of thinking about solving adaptive challenges. I'll pause for a moment. I've got a couple of extra things to share, but I'll just see what Corey's got or whether there's any other questions come through as I'm talking. But one of the things that I found most fascinating is org structures. So org structures, in many ways, are an organisation's memory of how to solve a technical challenge. So we build a structure to support doing things that we know how to do, and it's really efficient, and it's a really great way of defining work to be done. And all of these adaptive challenges that we're working with these organisations on, and they are really the subject of leadership development. I think it's the best substrate you can ever imagine for developing people, because we develop when we have to. So we always talk about, like, how do we have cross-functional work and all these things. You just find an adaptive challenge, put it in the middle of the table, and you'll quickly discover that no one person owns it. So in order to make progress against it, you've got to work together cross-functionally. And so you've got the perfect example, the perfect use case. You don't need to invent a use case. They're here at the moment. And these things all seem to sit between the cracks of org structures. So I see, Patrick, you asked, how do you discern the difference? One of the differences, I think, is that there's no clear owner. It's like whack-a-mole. If you get 5 people around the table and start having a conversation, I've literally seen this. Who owns this challenge? And you could go on for 3 days, because nobody owns it. It's new. The org chart where ownership and all of those things are defined was designed for a different world than this particular challenge. And so that's a great way. And it creates, it really elevates the need for people to exercise their interpersonal skills and lean into taking leadership on, again, to quote Ron, on the edge of your formal authority. Being able to just step beyond the boundaries that you've been given in your organisation and take some leadership around there. And we've had some really fun examples of that, incredible conversations, and you just, again, you can sort of stand back and just watch. It's really developing talk, because people are going, oh, okay, that's what's at stake here. So I'll pause before I talk about skills, Corey, and see if there's anything coming up for you.
Yeah, Carl, one of the things on my mind is, because it's so important, I think we've seen some great examples of organizations saying it's not only our senior leaders who need to be able to do this, but it's really individual contributors up through C-suite. You want to talk a little bit about what we've seen and the importance?
Yeah, actually, it's everyone's job. These are I know these are one-liners, but it's like you read these things, and I was first reading about this years ago, and now it's just really makes sense. The people with the problem are the problem and are the solution. And so, leadership has to be exercised everywhere for these. It's like you can't decide what needs to be done at the C-suite or the VP level, the director level, and then just cascade it down. It's like everyone's dealing with these things. So the idea of actually giving a large part of the organisation access to this terminology is really useful. And another response to that question about how do you know the difference is pretty easily normally. Often, I do the same sort of 5-minute thing I did at the start here and stop, and everyone in the team or group goes, oh, bang, 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 and just start naming it. And instantly they recognise when they've made some of those common mistakes in the past. The one, though, that also relates to what you're saying, Corey, is there's a lot of chatter and work going on at the moment, for good reason, about skills and defining skills. Part of it's being driven by what we're talking about with AI and the fact that work is kind of like a series of gigs, and roles are evolving so quickly. Because roles are evolving so quickly in the work that we ask people to do, it sort of forces us to start thinking about, well, what are the underlying skills that we need from people? And, there's a job that's been done, which skills do we need? And we get people with those skills, we understand what skills people have got, they come to around that, they fix the job, and they move on to something else. And there's this sort of gigification of work, which people talk about, is driving this desire to define skills. Yet, it was with, I can say it's with the Google School of Leadership, we were working and trying really hard to define the skills of the future and what were the most important skills for the next 5 years. And this was 2 or 3 years ago. And the end conclusion we got to was that the most important skill is the skill to acquire skills, because they were just changing so rapidly. And I was part of a panel not that long ago, recently, and it was around recruitment. And 3 years ago, nobody was defining the skill to prompt AI models as something that was important for jobs. Like, nobody saw that. The models were there at that point too, and yet now it's pretty much a requirement for most jobs. So we're not very good at anticipating the future, and I don't think we should be. We need to be good at adapting to the things that come through, and so that's where there's been a lot of interest and deep in the organisation and actually helping provide people with a learn to learn framework, or actually just acknowledging that you can't sit on one skill set forever. And I'm an optimist. I think this is actually good for people. I think we're naturally good at learning. We just often put structures and things into place to stop us constantly learning. So that's where I go with that one. I mean, this whole high-tech angle, Corey, you shared a story with me, which I'd love you to share with the group here, about a visit you had just last week, actually, to an innovation centre. And so I've sort of been talking about commercialising large tech firms. What you were talking about was a research and development kind of example, where there was some fundamental R&D going on that an organisation was talking about, and it prompted us to have a discussion about adaptive technical and how that related. So be awesome if you could share that with the group here too. Thanks.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. So it's pretty interesting. A cosmetics company really facing an adaptive challenge. They knew the challenge they wanted to solve, didn't know how to solve it, and it has to do with the cooling properties of cosmetics. So really rethinking the role of cosmetics. The challenge here is they don't have the technology in-house. No one has uh, thought about cosmetics in this way. And so what they're doing at this point is talking to other organizations, tech companies, about how to leverage their technology in new ways. And so what was interesting to me about this one is oftentimes when we're talking to organizations, we're talking about, tapping into colliding perspectives within the organization. But this is really organization to organization, helping each other to solve adaptive challenges. Don't have an update on this. This is a challenge right now. But if you see cosmetics with some cooling properties, you'll know that they were successful in solving this. This one also made me think of another organization that we're working with. They're 100-year-old plus global food company. And what they've really realized is they need to shift strategy. And so oftentimes organizations are thinking about, what does the new strategy need to look like? What does the structure need to look like? But they're really doing an excellent job thinking about what kind of culture are we going to need to deliver on this strategy? And it's really a performance culture. And so just thinking about, again, shifting the hearts and minds of people who've worked for this company for, in some cases, decades, long organizational history, really encouraging them to think and act in new ways. And what's been so energizing about partnering with them is leaning into the power of storytelling. And Amanda, I really appreciated your comment here about how do you create space for people to sit in ambiguity and build awareness. And this organization is really doing it through the power of senior leaders telling stories, personal stories, rather than running through a deck on these are the changes that we need to make to enable this new strategy. That's what I'd share there, Carl.
Yeah, you reminded me as you talked about the first part of that too. Before getting into leadership development, I did some work with a research and venturing group in a large organisation, and they were talking about creating innovation ecosystems where you sort of made your organisation porous and invited others in. And, I couldn't work out why it was so hard back then. This was the engineering me, why it was so hard, because it logically made so much sense. But I think what was required was just a different mindset altogether. And if I'd known the language and the ideas around the types of mindsets that drive adaptive leadership and these things that we're talking about right now, I think it would have really, really helped. So it's kind of like one of those. I'm also cautious that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And at the moment, this it feels a bit like a hammer because it's just such a useful framework. One thing that has come up a lot too is the idea of practicing this sort of leadership is often challenges our idea of what it means to be a good leader, because when you are working on things that are between previously worked out, how do I say this? When you're managing a process and solving a lot of technical problems, probably one of your biggest jobs is to keep people happy and engaged. But when you're dealing with things that are fundamentally novel and new, sometimes people aren't happy. And that's a feature, not a bug. And we sort of, again, people, like all of us, don't like inflicting sort of loss or pain on other people, even if it's for the greater good, which it should be. And so that causes some reticence to do the work that's required. And I think you hear this all the time in organisations where people are sort of saying, oh, they're not, it's obvious what needs to happen. They. Whereas actually what's tricky for the they is that by taking those steps that is obvious for everything, it's going to really, inconvenience some other groups. And it's amazing when you're doing this work with clients how often that comes up and how often it is. I'm just sort of thinking about those two reflective questions. I think it's the thing that stops us applying and doing some things that we know we should do because we're scared. And we're scared of the people that won't be happy. And it doesn't feel like good leadership. It doesn't feel like good leadership development, but I think it's part of it.
That really resonates with me, Carl. And the flip side of it as well. So one of the tech companies that we've been working with, as we were talking about adaptive versus technical, there was kind of a pause in the room. What's going on? And they said, oh my gosh, we realize now that our teams, when they hit an adaptive challenge, they just push that up to us. And I've been encouraging that. And now I realize, these leaders said, that I actually need to keep it down with them so they can build some of their adaptive skills rather than they're just here to solve technical problems and I'm the one that solves adaptive.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so easy to say and it's so hard to do, right? We were in a conversation a couple of years ago and there's this decentralization project. Was an agile transformation. There was a lot more empowerment given to mid-level leadership, and that's what everyone had been asking for. And bureaucracy was being cut and got out of the way, and it absolutely bombed. Like it totally bombed because with empowerment and with the ability to take leadership comes a lot of responsibility. And if you've never had that and never been exposed to it and never had a chance to practice it, it's very confronting. And it's not, it's hard. And so that's where, back to these tech firms that I'm impressed with, to be honest, at the moment, is that they're leaning into that. They're aware that people aren't prepared for that and that they're like trying to lean into that, prepare them for that, like careful what you wish for in some ways. That'll go to the last sort of before we move to questions, story or anecdote that I was going to share is this is amusing that I've had, and I've got another example of it today, and it's even just been coming up in this conversation, is the role of history and how valuable I think it is to learn from history. So organisations often go through these centralisation, decentralisation cycles, and we sort of tend to think of it as madness. And we think that each time we do that, we're dealing with an adaptive fully adaptive problem. Yet if we really hover back and get really on the balcony, there's a HBR article written in the 70s called Evolution and Revolution as Organisations Grow. And the more research that's been done, the more times it seems to be getting more relevant, not less, and that organisations go through a series of pretty predictable stages in their growth. And things that work for one period of their growth start to be the very thing that causes their downfall. And so these things aren't bad. As I saw Mark put in the chat there before about the power of context, they just have their time. And their very success, such as like strong entrepreneurial directive leadership or founder mode, without it, you don't get going. You don't get escape velocity as an organisation. But eventually, that limits the organisation to one person, and eventually it needs to be let go of. And these are common patterns that go right through organisations' growth. At each time, an inflection point, it probably looks entirely adaptive for everyone in it, and it looks like this is completely novel and it's chaos. Yet I think if we step back a bit and actually start getting curious about history and some case studies, and I've been always very critical of trying to learn from previous cases and things, but I think if you let go of the rules and start thinking about the patterns and some underlying heuristics, then there can be something really useful in there. I've just read Nexus, Yuval Nahari's latest book, and I won't bore you with that, but it sort of looks about a big, long arc of human history and our use of information systems. And it's just like, whoa, okay, so there's nothing new in what we're facing at the moment. And there's a whole lot of things that we as a society and organisations could learn from the past and cut ourselves and shorten a lot of the learning required. Yes, we're still going to have to do a lot of our own learning, but we could shortcut that. Whether we will or not is another challenge, but we could shortcut it. And the last thing I'll say on that is I'm in a group with a business owner who's got a piece of hardware that I won't go into details, but it deals with quantum physics. It deals with protons and neutrons. And at the quantum level, you can build a device that is absolutely identical to another device. And there is a 20 to 30% variation in output because that is a feature of quantum physics. So around the turn of the last century, we realised that we had to get away from this Newtonian idea that everything in the world could be decomposed into hard physical laws. And at the quantum level, it was more about statistics and probability. And when we embraced the idea of statistics and probability, science started flourishing again. And it really it's allowed satellites, GPS, cell phones, just about everything we enjoy today. And I think in the field of leadership and management, we're at a sort of a similar inflection. I think if it doesn't have to be all one or the other. It's not just technical, it's not just adaptive. There's this sort of area where there are rules and heuristics and sort of guiding patterns that we can lean into that can really help us make a lot of progress. Just don't expect them to be rules, though. And that's just a new musing. So I'd love to pause there and engage in conversations or experiences that any of you have had of that moving forward too. But yeah, Corey, do you want to take us through to the last part?
Yeah, would love. The chat's been really active, so would love come off mute and ask a question. What are you curious about? Or what examples have you had? What have you seen?
Yeah, for me, the pandemic was probably the ultimate mass adaptive leadership challenge. And you know what? The most successful organizations that navigated their way through it did adopt adaptive leadership almost to the playbook that you're describing. And yet we still organization like that seems to have faded in memory, and we're still having the adaptive leadership conversation. One of the things about the pandemic that was unique is it was universal and the why was very clear. So in addition to adaptive leadership as a method to implement change, or I wonder if it's equally important to have that universal clarity around why and what the challenge actually is that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, John, I had I think this was in Nexus, the book that I just referenced, but he said that through history, people have are always making a trade-off between liberty and certainty. And I think when you have something like the pandemic, and I thought liberty and certainty, that's kind of like directive leadership, delegative, or centralisation, decentralisation. And it's always this thing. I think what happens with something like the pandemic is it just takes away that trade-off. There's only you've got that clear, compelling boom. I had a change leadership professor that once said, you can't manage change. You can't sort of like decide to change. You change when you need to, when you have to, in response to some things. And the trick is to start to see those signals as early as possible. So I think that's where in some ways something like the pandemic makes that why easy. But I just couldn't agree with you more about that being the focus probably to get to. And from there, things actually get quite easy.
And hence the storytelling is incredibly powerful way to resonate. Yeah.
Mm.
I'm looking at your note here, Devin. Karen's question.
Yeah. Hey guys, I had a question around the adaptive leadership in a very process-based retailer. So obviously, I mean, there's a lot of people on this call who know me, so I'm working for foodstuffs, which obviously we have that, but not always, because we have different banners, right, with different brand propositions and different strategies. So I guess the curiosity for me is always, if you've got adaptive leadership taken to the extreme, you're going to have people who potentially want to go and try and improve processes or and change things which actually might be great in a really small bespoke boutique food retailer but actually don't scale. And so then how do you sort of manage that natural tension that you get between adaptive leadership and a large scalable strategic direction, which still has an element of customer experience in it? Does that make sense?
It does, Amanda.
Mm.
It's a great question. And I think that's one of the things that we really, honestly, as we were designing this offering with the client, we were really clear that we would also talk about if there's already best practice to solve the technical challenges, we don't need 2,000 people coming up with their own solutions, right? So it was really identification of more of the challenges, whether it be crisis or unexpected, places where there really weren't challenges already. So that conversation around adaptive leadership was preceded by, look, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If it's a challenge that's already been solved and they're focused on efficiency and streamlining, measuring the number of times an apple is touched, measuring how many steps people take on the sales floor. So that's what I would say is that putting it in this context of if it's a solved problem, the goal here is not to resolve that problem. Carl, what would you add there? Yeah.
Yeah, behind what you said, Corey, I think is just the language. I had this. I was in India. It was one of these big tech firms last year, and I got the chance to sit in a car on the way back from these workshops that we've been running with one of the executives, and hear what he was saying. He's just like, everyone in our organisation needs this language. And he said, if everyone in this organisation has this language, then we can actually have conversations about this, all talking about the same thing. Because what he was observing is people were sort of tackling it with all sorts of different lenses and perspectives and conversations. And so if you can normalise the language and normalise the mindsets, then I think you can make a lot of progress on it. It's kind of like, it's trust, but not fully trust. It's equip and then trust. And that was stealing from what he was doing. So he was like, you've got to have an open program that's simple and just gets this out to as many people as possible. And then we can trust people to actually have conversations to work it out.
Thanks, so.
Just before we go to you, Patrick, too, I see, Devin, the question that you put in there about org structure. I don't have that much experience with this, but I've got an opinion, and so I'll share it. I think often the org structures react too quickly before we've resolved them, and it's kind of like a technical fix to an adaptive problem that's not fully understood. I think an org structure change is a really good response sometimes, and I've seen it work incredibly well, but often too reactive and too fast. And so just adding to what we just shared with Amanda, if you sort of get that language and actually properly understand some of these things, some adaptive challenges that group organisations are working with, and we've seen examples of this, truly do become technical. They get worked out and everyone's kind of got it. That's the time to put some roles around it, define the jobs, and just be really good at doing it. But don't do that too soon. Otherwise you just end up in this. We're not working with them at the moment, but Facebook used to call it thrashing, from one to another to another to another. And that was their sort of term of like, we're always trying to chase our tail before we've actually ever understood what we've got behind.
The other thing I'd add there is oftentimes work groups, people who are working together, not necessarily on the same team, are best able to handle adaptive challenges. So I'd be hesitant to change org structure too fast. I would instead lean into helping people, creating the conditions that people want to, need to work together to solve a problem. All right, maybe one more question, and then I want to talk about what's next. If you're interested in this, want to know more, want to do something. Thanks, Karen. Oh, Patrick. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Comment and a question. So, Corey, just in terms of what you were saying a couple of minutes ago, an old mentor of mine said around adaptive challenges, his comment was, if you have facts, mysteries, or puzzles that you can provide, do that. Otherwise, let them do their own thinking. So I use that all the time. When I first heard it, I was like, oh, wow, that was pretty good. But the question I have is this. I was thinking about mindset in relation to adaptive learning. And I was thinking of two situations. One, a big tech company where the first real useful product in AI is a medical thing. However, the background of the chief technologist is in the medical sphere. And then I'm also thinking about some statistics I've seen where in some small town in Wisconsin, there's a lot of orthopedists who specialize in knees. So guess what? There's a lot of knee surgeries that go on because of their orientation and mindset. So I would love to hear that seems like a potential mitigating factor to me to really being adaptive, given how it is that I see the world. So how do you correlate mindset to adaptive learning? I know I'm a troublemaker. Okay. Anybody else?
Thanks. I'm going to go first. Thanks, Pat. It's a setup, Patrick, because it's like you basically quoted it. That I can't think of who it is, but we see the world as we are, not as it is. And if our mindsets are really made up of our experiences, your example of the orthopedics there makes perfect sense. It's a consolidated set of experiences. We see challenges as we want them to be, not necessarily as they are. And so if we're unconscious of our mindset, we see the problem present as we kind of want it to present, and therefore we do what we think is going to work for that, and so we're not actually seeing it. So the conversation that we have around mindsets is just like, and it's amazing how much difference. I've been truly thrilled actually with how much difference just awareness of mindsets can make. Like when you share with people in organisations that generally, they're pretty smart, high functioning, that they have different mindsets. That's an accumulation of their experiences and things that have worked for them in the past. Other people have mindsets and they might be different. And there's nothing personality driven by that. It's just accumulation of your experiences. You can kind of choose to see things differently. It's a massive tool in this adaptive thing. So you can actually ask people to try on a different mindset. We've obviously got a framework that we have to categorise leadership mindsets, but I'd argue you could do it with any categorization. Try on different mindsets and see how the challenge looks when you look at it through that different mindset. Even better, have a lot of different experiences and reflect on those experiences and develop your own different mindsets. But I think that's by far the best way for we're pattern recognizing machines. We want the world to be as we think it's going to be. So that's just something to constantly guard against and just realize we've got this filter of our mindsets, which we're seeing the world through. And if we could just, for a moment, try on a different filter, we'll actually get a bigger picture, better picture of it. So that's what I'd have to say to that one. I think it's a really good point. We should have led with that, really, Patrick.
Thanks for that, Patrick. The other thing I'd add there is, because they're adaptive challenges, technical training is not going to solve them. But vocabulary around mindsets we've seen be super successful. So in our last handful of minutes, just want to say thank you so much. Great engagement, great questions. Really appreciated it. If you want more, here's some things we have coming up. Devin's going to drop some links into the chat for us. But we have our 50 Adaptive Leaders of Tomorrow. This is a way that we give back to leaders across the globe. It's an opportunity to experience one of our programs for no charge. We have leadership action networks running across the globe. We have the Melbourne Incubator coming up. If you want something customized for your team or your org, certainly we can do that. Thank you for adding all of that, Devin. And next up for Global Chats is going to be Sam from Oricon. I'm talking about shaping a culture of self-leadership. So with that, thank you so much. Devin and Mark, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the time and your curiosity.
Yeah, and from me, I just appreciate your interest in this topic. We're really grateful for it. I think, I think it's such an important thing for our world and planet as we move forward. All of us trying to thrive together. It's just the more interest and experiments and focus we can give this, I think it's better for us all. So just appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks all.